We are getting started, so we're a little early, but I want to thank you. So we're back to Q&A, live Q&A right after worship. I'm Pastor Dave, obviously, and Charlie's up in the booth, running around like a madman, and we give him thanks for that. And
Yes.
With me is Dan, as usual. So ask away, if I don't know the answer, I'll make one up that sounds good, and then we'll...
And we'll believe you.
Right, you're right. We'll go from there.
Although maybe we shouldn't believe you.
Well,
Because?
See, that gets into that classic, if a liar says he's telling the truth, is he telling the,
Well, that gets us right into the readings today.
Yes, it does.
Because Paul in Thessalonians says, test everything.
Yes.
Do not despise the words of prophets, but test everything. And I love that personally, because Paul sounds like a scientist there.
Yeah.
And what did he mean by that? Did he mean just don't take everything at face value? Did he?
So in the early church, church prophet was a position as much as like pastor or bishop was. There was also these wandering prophets, and
So prophet was an occupation.
Yeah, prophet, right. So a congregation or a group of congregations would have a prophet in addition to a pastor and a bishop and all that. They would have a prophet and a deacon, and prophet was one of these jobs that was around in the early church. They typically didn't stay in one place very long. They wandered. They were very
itinerant.
Yeah, they were very itinerant prophets, exactly. So the danger with prophecy is somebody says, "Oh, God told me this directly." Okay. How do you...
Did he send it as a telegraph?
Well, and what's the message? You can say a lot of things and get people to do a lot of things, and history bears this out. If somebody says, "Oh, God told me to do this directly."
Yeah.
And that's not to say God doesn't do that. I firmly believe God does that. But with that as a role, it's open to that kind of danger. And so part of what Paul is telling the Thessalonians is kind of as a final bit of advice. Hey, when somebody says this, that's fine. Prophecy is real. Believe in prophecy. But you've got to test what they're saying against what Scripture and tradition say. Because God will not give you individually a message that contradicts the church, the community.
Yeah.
And that's the part you've got to be very careful about.
Well, how do you know? People are still saying, like televangelists will often get on and say, "I was just talking to God and he said do this."
Yeah.
So how do you know? How do you know if it's legit? And they're just making up, or they're deluding themselves. They believe it, but it's just not real.
Yeah. I have a couple kind of baselines, and so God will never give you a message that goes against what Jesus says, and so if somebody's telling you hate your neighbor, no. That's and the other reason Paul's saying test everything is that Paul firmly believes, I do too, that there are other spirits out there giving you other messages. They're not all benign. And so you could get a message very clearly, but is the message from God or is it from something else?
Yeah.
That could be demonic, that could be, but it could, there's lots of other spirits out there.
Yeah.
And so, and I said this in Bible study, I said, I think the spiritual world is as filled with different creation as the natural world is, and so be careful, is kind of Paul's point. Anyway, so God will never give you a message that contradicts what Jesus says. And so if you get a message that says hate your brother or sister, in some form or another, that's wrong. Whatever that is, it's not God telling you that.
Yeah.
As convinced as you may be that it is. God will never give you a message that contradicts Scripture, so if you've got a message that says, I know Bible says this, but this is what God says, no. It doesn't work that way. And in general, remember that it's about grace, that it's a loving and merciful God, and that's the heart of who God is. And so be very suspicious, not that God's never angry. God is angry sometimes. But if you've got a direct message that's all fire and brimstone, be careful. Because you got to be careful whether that's actually God or whether that's what you want. Because frequently fire and brimstone's directed at especially when the message is fire and brimstone directed at the people I don't like. Then that's especially like, okay, be careful, because we have an incredible power to deceive ourselves.
Yeah.
And so be careful with that. Yeah. And then the final test is, it comes from the book of Acts, actually, when the Jewish leadership is trying to decide what to do with the early Christians. There's a rabbi there called Gamaliel, and he says, well, I recommend we just sit back and wait. Everybody asks him, why should we sit back and wait? And he goes, well, if it's nothing will come of it. It'll fade away very quickly. Uh-huh. If it is of God, there's nothing you could do to stop it. And that's the final test, is if it's truly nothing, it will fade. It won't go anywhere. And if it is of God, well, then you won't be able to get in its way. Yeah. And so sometimes patience is the final test.
Sounds like a very wise rabbi.
Yeah, he was.
Did he have other writings?
So depends on if you think that Gamaliel is the same Gamaliel that there is a rabbi in Jewish history called Gamaliel who we have a lot of writings of. But it depends on if you think that's the same guy. Yeah. So if it is, yes. If it's not, according to tradition, he's also Paul's teacher, supposedly.
Oh,
actually.
Wow. Cool.
Yeah. We have a little fragment of his writings, and he's complaining about a student who's very headstrong and very sure of himself and likes to use words a lot. And
sounds very much like Paul.
Sounds very much like Paul. He doesn't ever say Paul's name, but it's like, yeah, I think I know who you're talking about. So it's kind of funny.
Well, you mentioned, from the messages, be sure it's coming from the right source.
Yeah.
And that you believe there are all kinds, just in the natural physical world, there are all kinds of creatures. There are in the spiritual world, too. And that brings up something that you've already mentioned offline, or in Bible study, but for the sake of today, and because with Christmas coming, there's a lot of talk of angels, Gabriel, and the hosts come to the shepherds, and blah, blah, blah. And, I had asked you why everybody was so afraid, because if you have these beautiful people in robes, glowing with their wonderful, lustrous white feathers, why would people be afraid of that?
Yeah.
And you blew my mind.
Yeah, showed you a little, yeah. So why are they afraid of angels?
Yeah.
So there's a comic, you can go look it up, where it's a picture of an angel, and it says, "Do not be afraid," and the person says, "This is the scariest moment of my life," because he's looking at an angel, and in the comic, the angel is just a mass of wings and eyes. And that's actually how the Bible describes some of the angels. They're just masses of wings and eyes. And so we have this very stylized picture of angels. And so cherubs are little babies, right, with
little baby wings.
Yeah, little baby wings. No. Okay.
So what does a cherub actually look like?
So a cherub is this fearsome creature that guards the very throne of heaven, is kind of its role.
And a cute little baby with baby wings isn't gonna.
No, right. This is the thing that, these are the four living creatures that are on the other side of the throne of God, night and day. Seraphim are described as, wings and fire, constantly. These beings are actually pretty terrifying, if you actually encountered one.
Well, essentially what we would call monsters.
Yeah, right. I mean, in some ways they would look more like something from Cthulhu, than they would like anything that we would recognize. And so, or at least from the little descriptions we get, and so it's one of those things where they are very different. They are of an entirely different order than we are.
Yeah.
And they would be terrifying. It would be absolutely terrifying to meet one of these things in real life.
Yeah.
You know.
So it sounds like the way we typically envision demons and monsters are the way all angels look. So like, after the fall, my mom used to say, well, they have leather wings as demons because after the fall, they were transformed. But it sounds like, no, they really weren't. They always looked monstrous.
Right. They always looked weird, and scary, because they are just very different, and we picture them as, Gabriel's always wearing a toga, and don't get me wrong, Renaissance art is beautiful, but Renaissance art, one of the things it's trying to do is to put Bible stories in that moment that they're painting in.
Yeah.
So like Romans always wear medieval coats of armor, in Renaissance art. And so in a similar way, angels always look very human in Renaissance art. A lot of them probably do not look very human, given what things like Isaiah describe. If you want a picture of it, Isaiah chapter 6, just read that and you'll get the many wings and shouting and screaming and all sorts of stuff.
So chapter 6 is our reference point. Renee wondered, write down, what about halos? Are halos biblical?
No.
That's also an art.
Yeah, that's an art thing. And that's a much older art thing. And that's how you tell who's who in a certain picture. And that's true. It's a really good thing, actually. I mean, there's a modern updated version of the nativity scene called Jose and Maria, which go look it up. But even there, the artist creatively figures out ways to stick halos on various characters in the, and that's just to tell you who's who, who's Mary, who's Jesus, who's Joseph, who are the saints.
It's like the good guys with white hats.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, right. Yeah, Westworld. The white hat guys are the good guys, and you're good.
Speaking of good guys, we got our crazy John the Baptist.
John the Baptist.
And in today's reading, John's always perplexed me. I've always admired him. I always thought he was one of the coolest people in the Bible.
Yeah.
But it's almost like the Bible doesn't know how to handle him.
Yes.
Like in today's reading.
By the way, the reason that it seems that way is because it doesn't know how to handle it.
Okay, so the perception is accurate.
Perception is accurate, yes.
But John says he confessed and did not deny it. But it doesn't refer to what he was denying. So what is he denying in there?
That he's the Messiah.
I
am not the Messiah. Yeah.
So why does it say he did not deny that? Because
John's got a very peculiar idiom that comes from, he writes what we call baby Greek. It's perfect. It's flawless. There's no grammatical problem with it. But part of the reason there's no grammatical problem with it is because he does things like, he doesn't use contractions. He did not deny. He lays everything out. It's just the way John writes because it's flawless. It's the easiest stuff to translate. Every first year Greek student's given John, because it's easier to translate.
You're not gonna have to worry about it.
Right? Yeah, you really won't. Paul's all over the place, but John's like, okay, I can do John. Yeah.
We hear this phrase a lot. Make straight the way of the Lord.
Yeah.
What is the context of that? As a kid, and unfortunately it's carrying over to me now, it sounds like we're supposed to make a road and make it very straight from here, from Bethany to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
But what did that actually mean outside of that physical context? What was John saying we needed to do?
So it's a quote from Isaiah chapter 40. And in the context, make a path in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. So in context, what God is saying there is, chapter 40 is where God starts promising to bring the people home from exile. And so when God says, make straight the way of the Lord, make a straight path from Babylon to Jerusalem. I'm going to bring my people home.
Okay.
And there's not going to be an extended detour.
It's not going to be 40 days.
You're not going to be 40 years again.
Yeah.
You're going home, this time. So that's kind of the context when John says that. God is coming to you to save you, is the context of that Isaiah passage that he uses. And so make a path straight through the most inhospitable terrain because God's coming straight to you, and it's like a wake of a ship. It's going to clear everything out, out of your way.
So spiritually, is he saying repent? The end is near, kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, so John sees this as, and there's this element of Christmas, right? Like, watch out, God is coming. This is a great opportunity to shape up, because God's about to come here, and you don't know what he'll do when he gets here. And so you've been delaying this. Well, now it's time to stop delaying. It's kind of John's attitude. Now is time to stop putting this decision off. It could happen now, and get ready. Yeah. Is kind of his point.
Straighten up and fly right.
Yeah, straighten up and fly right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we've got this interesting jumping around in time, right? We're getting ready for the nativity, for the birth of Jesus.
Right.
Whereas John's obviously talking right around 30 years later.
Right. Way after.
Trying to keep all that straight. And this is another cultural thing that probably gets back to the art. John's always portrayed as older.
Yeah.
And yet he's only, 5 months older than Jesus?
6 months older. Basically.
6 months older.
Yeah.
So why do we portray John as this older guy? Almost bestial too. He's always portrayed as kind of bulky and strong.
I think that's because our image of prophet is guy with a big white beard. And that's the image of who a prophet is, and John's very much a prophet, and we've tried to make Jesus look as tame as possible, and so Jesus looks he's brushed his hair, John can't find a comb,
Jesus wears nice clean robes, John's in camel hair.
John's in camel hair, and there's probably something to that, I would bet John was messier. I would bet John was, less clean than Jesus was.
They spent a lot of time in the water.
Right. Well, yeah, right. I know, right. Jordan River's not that clean. Jordan River's actually not a beautiful place. So
kind of like the Mississippi, it's more of a muddy.
Yeah, it's really more of a creek. It's, if you read the Bible, it makes the Jordan River sound like this mighty, Amazon-like thing.
Yeah.
It's really just a little creek that kind of runs from the Dead Sea to the Sea of Galilee.
Right. So it's
not a very impressive.
You kind of hop over it if you want.
Right. It's why there's a story in the Old Testament where a Syrian general has to go wash in the Jordan to be healed, and he goes, "Aren't there more impressive rivers in Damascus?" And that's why he says that, because it's really not it's not all that impressive, really. Yeah.
Well, you've mentioned before that there are still followers of John.
Yeah.
In Israel.
Still followers of John.
Given that, do we have a clearer idea of what his message was beyond? Because the Bible doesn't really say a lot outside of what we read today.
Yeah. So John's probably apocalyptic. Well, he is apocalyptic. He's absolutely apocalyptic. There was a group that lived out in the wilderness. It's the group that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're called Essenes. And they were all kind of like John. And we kind of think that John was either an Essene himself or somebody who spent time with a group like them. That they lived out in the wilderness. They're pretty sure that the end is coming
anytime.
Really quickly. It's imminently coming. They're pretty sure that the established religious figures are corrupt, to the very core. And so the only solution is to kind of separate yourself from the whole temple establishment. Is this sounding like John yet?
Yeah, it's sounding like John, and even contemporary,
Yeah.
Beware the man.
Right, beware the man, right. And they had good reason. The chief priest at this point was actually a Roman puppet. It was kind of appointed by Roman officials. The temple establishment was corrupt. Then
went hand in hand with Herod.
Right, and it was hand in hand with Herod. It was also a corrupt Roman official. And so they're right. about that. They're right about that criticism. So we're pretty sure that's kind of John's context. That's where he comes from. A lot of these groups still exist, so there are still Samaritans. They actually live in a little village in Israel, Palestine. There's only the one village, but there are still Samaritans, There's still Assyrians, it's actually a recognized ethnic group still in the Middle East. Chaldeans, right? Going all the way back to Abraham, right? Ur of the Chaldeans, that's where he comes. Well, Chaldeans still exist, actually. They're Iraqi Christians, actually. There's a ton of, especially in like Detroit area, there's a ton of Chaldean refugees. And they are vehement Catholics, actually, at this point. But so all these groups, a lot of these groups still exist. They're not distant, long gone. Yeah.
It brings up so much of how much history is still alive that we think has long been dead.
Right. They're not dead. They are still there. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, what about, speaking of that, it seems like John ghosted Jesus for most of his life, right? Here they are cousins.
Yeah.
They're born 6 months apart. Obviously, Mary and Martha, their moms, would get together. So why did John kind of ghost Jesus? There's like no mention until, oh, look, my cousin's coming up to be baptized.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to know so this is part of the reason, I said, you're right, the Bible doesn't really know what to do with John. The four Gospels are kind of, you can tell by the way they write about it, they're kind of embarrassed that Jesus got baptized by John. And you can tell that because as they get progressively later, the explanation gets kind of more and more convoluted, and the actual baptism moment gets more and more downplayed. So in Mark, Jesus gets baptized. By John, there's no explanation. It happens.
He just shows up.
Right. Mark's the earliest. It's pretty clear it happened. By the time we get to John, John actually doesn't depict Jesus getting baptized. He just says John says, oh yeah, when I baptized him, I saw the Holy Spirit descend on him. But by the time we get to John, it's so removed, like the actual moment's not depicted, and so it's hard to know what the exact relationship was there. A lot of people think that Jesus started off under John.
It was basically one of John's disciples.
Yeah, and then John got arrested because the actual timeline is, in Mark, it tells us John started preaching against Herod. And so
that's sedition.
Yeah, so John gets arrested, and then Jesus, right after John gets arrested, according to Mark, then Jesus pops on the scene, and starts leading his own movement.
And I can see that in a sense. And I don't remember which gospel it's in, but they talk about some of John's people come to check on Jesus and what he's preaching.
Right. And say, are you the one, or should we wait for another?
Yeah.
Right.
And it almost sounds like they're leery of Jesus. It's like, are you kind of trying to steal followers from John?
Well, so John sends them, right?
Yeah.
And like John's whole point there is like, it's basically, okay, this is not where I thought this was going. I'm sitting in prison, like I'm about to be beheaded. This is not where I thought this whole thing was going.
Yeah.
This is not the plan I originally envisioned. And so he says, so are you really it? Or are we going to wait again? And
did I do all this for nothing?
Yeah, did I do all this for nothing? And Jesus' response is, well, the dead are raised, the blind see and the deaf hear. What more do you want? How much clearer can I be? But yeah, John does have that moment with Jesus, and he does say, this wasn't exactly how I envisioned it being, what's going to happen?
Yeah, it almost seems like, in that regard, the authorities were more afraid of John than they were of Jesus until the very end.
Yeah, John's a threat to everything, right? And so there's this whole temple establishment, right? And it's wildly profitable. That's the trick you gotta. the temple gets its own tax on top of all the other taxes people had to pay. The temple gets its own tax. It's this means of control. It's why the Romans are interested in appointing the high priest, is because it can control the regional population.
Yeah.
And so it's wildly popular. It's wildly profitable, this whole temple establishment. And John's just kind of lobbing grenades at it, at its foundations. Because he's a baptism for the forgiveness of sins. What it's saying is you can be forgiven without the temple establishment.
Yeah.
You have access to forgiveness without the money changers and the sacrifice and the temple structure, and
buying a couple turtle doves from the stall as you go in.
Yeah, from the stalls. I mean, it cuts everybody's business, it just cuts down on everybody's business, and so that's what I would say is that's why they're afraid of John. Jesus isn't actually lobbing all that many grenades at the temple establishment until Palm Sunday.
Yeah, he shows up, he topples the tables.
Right, he topples then he's a threat, and it takes him a week for them to kill him.
Yeah. You're fine out there just gabbing your philosophy, but you start interfering with my cash flow.
Right, well, yeah, I had a professor who used to say Jesus spent 3 years debating the Pharisees, but he spends 1 week actually challenging power, and it kills him. And that illustrates the power dynamic, that he spent 3 years arguing with the Pharisees, but you go to the Sadducees, you go to the chief priests, death.
You got trouble.
Yeah.
Well, on that very upbeat and positive
note. I know, right? Yeah. We still got time.
Well, let's do something a little cheerier. Well, potentially a little cheerier. Well, this should be an easy one. From the descriptions in the Gospels of Jesus' birth, it does not sound like winter. It doesn't sound like December 25th.
No. Yeah.
It's definitely warmer. People are sleeping outside. So, when did the birth of Jesus actually take place, as far as we can tell? And then why did we switch over to December 25th as the birthday?
Yeah. Our best guess is probably like spring, and what we would consider spring. That's mostly based off the fact that Herod the Great is king when Jesus is born, but he dies pretty quickly. So he's pretty old actually at that point. And so...
Yeah, just to be clear, we're talking about different Herods when we're talking about John versus
Yeah, John... Herod named all his kids Herod. They were Herod Antipas and Herod. They all had different versions of Herod.
Kind of the George Foreman syndrome.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so, I had this family in my internship site where every boy was named William Perry King. Seriously. And they all had different version of Willem, Perry, William, Bill, they were all. And it's kind of like that. That's why based on when Herod dies, because you kind of work backwards. Herod had to die. Jesus needed to be born early enough so that Herod thinks he's a threat, right? So that puts us springtime sometime.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of reasons we do it on the 25th. Part of it is there has always been in human history a kind of midwinter festival. And if you think about it,
the whole solstice kind of celebration.
Yeah, solstice. Part of that is the solstice. Another part of it is I think it's a really just great opportunity if human beings need a reason to party. Because if you think about it, it's dark, it's gloomy, it's cold, it's miserable. In general, it's just awful. And you just need something to break up the monotony, because guess what? It's February from here on out.
Yeah.
February is the most miserable month in my opinion. And so the snow's gray at that. If we didn't have Christmas to break it up, it'd be pretty dreary from November to March. But we have this Christmas thing thrown in there in order to break up the thing. And so almost every human culture in the Northern Hemisphere has has a midwinter festival of some kind for that reason. And then there's two other reasons we have it on the 25th. So the Romans, around the time of Constantine, had a festival called the Feast of the Unconquered Sun, which was on the 25th. And that's S-U-N, but you can change that really quickly to S-O-N, you know.
Yeah.
Especially when Constantine converts, you know. And Constantine was a worshiper of the unconquered sun before he was a Christian. So it just fit really well. The other reason is the Romans had a holiday on the week of Christmas called Saturnalia. And Saturnalia, there was a game the Romans played, which was a role reversal game, where they liked to pretend slaves were masters and masters were slaves, right? And the Romans thought this was a great hit. You know, it's isn't this cool? You know.
So for one day, if you're a slave, you get to feel free.
Yeah, you get to feel free. You get to do what you kind of want, and they're not going to bother you. You know. So guess who all the Christians are? They're slaves. You know. So there's one day out of the year they can go and worship, kind of free from any other mess.
Yeah.
You know. So they worship Jesus on the 25th because that was the one day they could do it without any legal repercussions. You know. And from there, you get this long tradition of this is this really high holy day, you know, and then the calendar gets kind of gradually formalized. But yeah. I actually think that's the best explanation. It was the day we could all worship freely without fear, you know, and so of course we would celebrate Jesus and his coming into the world on that day.
Yeah.
What else would we? You know, what else would we do?
Yeah, it makes sense because Easter's already tied to Passover.
Right, Easter's fixed. We know when Easter is.
Yeah.
You know, and so since Easter's fixed, you know, yes, let's celebrate his coming into the world this day because.
So we get the Alpha and the Omega of his life.
Yep.
Cool.
So, yes.
All right. Well, I think that's our Omega question for today.
Yep.
And I encourage people, you know, especially coming in on the Christmas season. Send in your questions.
Yes.
Email Pastor Dave.
Right. Email me. Send in your questions.
Yeah. Post them on Facebook. We'll start being active on Facebook again.
Yep. We'll start being active on Facebook again. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Enlightening as always.
It is.
Every time. Blows my mind. Hope you blew yours too.
Yeah. Thank you for Q&A. We hope to see you another time. We still are hoping to do in-person worship on Christmas Eve. So. We might even figure out a way to sing, but we'll see.
You don't want me singing, believe me. I'll break all the microphones. Bye, everybody. Have a good week.
Goodbye, everybody.